the censor board decided that they would not allow your film to be shown. That was it. It was full stop. So I called it Bharat Ek Khoj. It was done in Hindi.
Correct.
And there were 53 hours altogether, from ancient India to modern India. So you have to consider yourself, as representative of humanity, as it is, as it were. That is truly timeless.
So the first thing I want to ask you is contrasting storytelling when you became a filmmaker and contrasting storytelling today. When you look back at your journey, your very epic journey, what were some of the challenges you faced then and the challenges you see filmmakers facing now? What has stayed common and what has changed?
As far as cinema is concerned, it's a question of how technology has needed to be used in order to make storytelling really effective. If you look at the history of cinema, automatically you know what the whole situation was, because first there was a theater. Now in the theater, the audience and the players are in exactly the same environment.
Sure.
The person who's performing to the audience, they have a special relationship.
Sure.
It depends on whether the audience is interested and how much the audience is interested, and how much does the person on the stage want the audience to actually be involved or alienated or whatever. But this, as soon as you bring the technology of cinema, there is no such situation.
Yeah.
Whatever happens has happened once and it will go on repeating itself.
Yeah.
So therefore, when you work in the cinema, one of the important things when you're working in the cinema is that you have to be conscious that once you said something, it's there forever.
Right. There's no going back.
Yeah, there's no going back from that decision which you took.
Right. Right.
And it remains there. Yeah. So you cannot change it once that's been done.
Right. These days, of course, one of the hot topics of debate and discussion is freedom of speech. Young filmmakers, we all go through the whole discussion of, we can't make what we want to make because of this scena and that scena and so on and so forth. Now, you made films in a time where society had a very narrow-minded view as to how film should be made. Narrow-minded or a very one-focused view of how film should be made. In that society, you made films like Mandi and Ankur and Manthan. So when you look at the problems we face today as far as freedom of speech are concerned, do they look trivial to you?
No, I think each generation has its own problems.
Yeah.
And in the case of the world as it exists,
right,
particularly in our country, one of the things is that there is in terms of media use,
correct,
a lot more people use media today.
Sure.
And social media, there's practically no kind of censorship on social media. And therefore, censorship, which was such a big deal at that time.
Right.
And because it meant that if the censor board decided that they would not allow your film to be shown, that was it. It was full stop.
There were no other avenues.
Yeah, no other avenues. But today there's no such thing.
Right.
Because of that, the sense of responsibility of a person who's doing anything in what is essentially social media, you have to be much more responsible.
Sure.
At that time, you left the responsibility to a body outside of yourself, which is the
to regulate you. Yeah.
Government, So you said, well, as long as the government allows you,
it's got to be.
You can do it.
Yeah.
But you never thought for yourself.
Yeah.
Whether it was the right thing to do or not. So the sense of social responsibility, in fact, becomes greater when there isn't
a governing body.
No big brother.
Yeah. That's a very interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is your first film that I saw was Zubeda when I was a child. And then I saw, Welcome to Sajjanpur. And then I started seeing Ankur and Bhumika and so on and so forth. So I discovered your brand in a reverse chronology, in a sense. As a filmmaker, is this, we talk about our brands and our storytelling brands. Is this something you ever went through in terms of when you had set a name for yourself? I can only make this kind of
You
cinema
see,
now.
no, it wasn't like that. The point was that I was always very interested in the cinema. And from a very young age. Also, I was very familiar with the cinema. And being familiar with the cinema had a lot to do with the fact that my father was a professional photographer, still
Yes.
photographer. But he took a lot of interest in moving pictures.
Yeah.
And so he had a little camera,
Right.
16 millimeter camera, and his, avocation was to make movies about his children, and he had large numbers of children.
Yeah.
So
Right.
we
Lots of stories to tell.
I'm one of 10
Yeah.
children. So my father made a film of every one of his children from the time they were born until the next child came. And we grew up
Yeah.
with these films being constantly shown to all manner of guests who came for dinners or for teas or whatever. And at the drop of a hat, my father was willing to show them these films.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was a very familiar thing, The cinema was very familiar. And therefore, expressing yourself through films
Right.
was also much easier
Sure.
on account of that, which is the reason I made my own first film. I made with my father's film camera. But that was when I was about 12. So there was no, so it's not something that, I could think of as being unique. There was nothing unique about it.
Yeah.
So in fact, in my case, I know that when Satyajit Ray made his first film, Pathe Panchali, in college, I just got into college at about that time. And my oldest brother, on one of my visits to Calcutta, because my brother used to live there, that was his home. And he said, since you're so crazy about movies and you talk about genre noir and all this kind of thing, why don't you go and see one of our own filmmakers? I said, what film? He said, a film called Pathe Panchali, and it's running in such and such cinema. And I went and saw that film, and I kept seeing that film every day as long as I was in Calcutta. So I must have seen it about 15 or 16 times while I was there, because it's one of those things, because it just I'd never seen anything so original and so seemingly effortless, natural, like it belonged to life.
Right.
That kind of quality,
Right.
which we were dying to create,
Yeah.
not knowing how, because we were stuck with a particular form of cinema in our country,
Right. Very true. So switching gears a little bit, my favorite work of yours is Bharat Ek Khoj. And I read somewhere that when it was offered to you by Doordarshan, you actually wanted to make one of the epics.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yes, I wanted to. In fact, you see, Doordarshan at that time had become suddenly national.
Yeah.
In the late 1980s.
80s. Yeah.
In the process, one of the things that the government of the day thought, of which I was also part, that television should not simply copy from the cinema, popular cinema. So it's not meant to do that.
Yeah.
It has to create its own market and audience and so on. And then, of course, there was the idea that the government, if it has a media like this under its control, then it is their responsibility to use it usefully for its population.
Correct.
So what was the usefulness? The idea was that, most importantly, we have to raise the literacy level of the country.
Sure.
And therefore, that was one of the first things that they thought of doing under Mrs. Gandhi, which actually did happen.
Yeah.
Then the other thing was that why don't we, because we have such a rich tradition in everything, and particularly in terms of epics, all of this, so we said, why don't we have, for instance, use our great epics? So the whole idea was that you had Raman, then you had Mahabharata, and then you had third, what is the third thing going to be? So I was at this meeting I was invited as a filmmaker, and so somebody, Ramanand Sagar, said he would like to do Ramayana. So they said, yes, go ahead and do it. So, and then someone else was B.R. Chopra. He said he would like to do Mahabharata. Actually, I wanted to do it, but then they gave it to him.
Right.
Because he was a senior filmmaker.
Sure.
I was just a junior, So I said, well, I want to do something. So he said, what would you like to do? I said, look, I want to do Discovery of India. And the book that Jawaharlal Nehru wrote, I mean, it is his version of Indian history. We will probably require to augment it in order to give ourselves our history via television, which in this country we've never had any means of doing. And before that, the only way we got any history was in classrooms.
Yeah.
And those were awfully written textbooks. And most of those textbooks, the origins of them were from some colonial writers, not even our own writers. So I said, all that can change.
Yeah.
And so I decided. So I called it Bharat Ek Khoj. It was done in Hindi.
Correct.
And there were 53 hours altogether, from ancient India to modern India. And it was not just Nehru's discovery of India, that was the base.
Right.
But the fact is that I had three different ways of looking at it. One was our traditional way of looking at our history.
Sure.
That was one aspect of it. The other thing was the way the academics were studying history or wanting us to learn history. That was the second. And the third was the book itself, the Discovery of India.
Right.
So I had these three levels to work simultaneously. There was a person who took us through history, which was Om Puri.
Yeah. Right.
So that was, he was taking us through that. While there was a kind of God's voice situation,
Right.
So to have you take you through history, which was a kind of overview.
Yeah.
Om Puri was speaking lines from Discovery of India. The traditional and the academic historians filling in where there were gaps in Nehru's book. And the third one was how traditionally we've had how history has been used. So, for instance, the story of Tipu Sultan, and even Ramayana, Mahabharata, so many Ramayana, so many Mahabharata. So we used all the different forms, different theatrical forms, as well as Katha forms, to tell our stories.
So I was born in 1988, and the interesting thing is Bharat Ek Khoj was created in an India in which I did not exist. So I've always wondered now, 31 years later, if you were to retell the history of India, we're still telling about a time before 1988, would it change just based on how society thinks today? Because history is history.
It doesn't change. It's a way of looking at history that might change. However, history itself will not change.
Right.
But the way we look at it will obviously change. You see, it depends, because today we look at the world in a slightly different way.
Sure.
Than we did, say, 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And certainly at the time when Nehru was writing
the book,
which was in the 1930s and into the 40s. So by the time Discovery of India came, he'd just come out of jail. So it was around the time of independence, little before independence. From then to now, it's over 70 years. Now, the fact is that obviously the world has changed. In the Indian experience itself has changed enormously. And for the present generation, the idea that we were a colony itself, it's not easy to imagine what it must have been.
Sure.
As a colony, for people who never experienced it, and didn't even know So all of those things we put together, you have a viewpoint that obviously different.
Yeah. So which film of yours do you think remains the most relevant, in your opinion?
You say films are very notorious for their short lifespan.
Sure.
Only because they record the world as it is at that moment. Even if
Snapshot.
you're dealing with history, you're dealing with history as perceived at that time.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't know. So it's one of those things that makes it stick to that particular time when it was made. Because of that problem, it's very difficult for films to jump out of their time and be in some ways timeless. And that timelessness often comes from the subject matter and the way you look at it, which is universal, which goes past your own time. And what is it that will make it so? Is your ability to deal with in everything in humanitarian terms.
Sure.
So you have to consider yourself, as representative of humanity as it is, as it were. That is truly timeless.
Right. Right.
So if films have that character built into them, they will last. Others don't.
Right. Makes sense, absolutely. Thank you so much, sir. Really appreciate taking the time. Thank you so much.